An elderly woman returned home from vacation and found a huge cocoon in her shed. When scientists opened it, the entire neighborhood had to be evacuated. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind had finally stopped. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the air over Beaumont, Texas was still, heavy, and damp with the scent of broken branches and wet soil. The small town had been rattled by a hurricane that ripped through the coast and moved inland, leaving behind a trail of scattered rooftops, leaning fences, and shattered windows. For most of the townspeople, life was just beginning to creep back toward something like normal. The electricity had returned, the roads were cleared of fallen trees, and the radio no longer spoke in warnings, but in weary voices talking about rebuilding. On the edge of town, near a long stretch of farmland bordered by pecan trees, stood the small weathered house of Ellen Mays. At 68, Ellen had seen her share of storms, but none like this. The hurricane had howled through her property for hours, tearing shingles from the roof and bending her garden fences like straw. Now, in the stillness that followed, the quiet felt almost unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. Ellen was a woman of habits. Every morning, she brewed her coffee, read a few pages of her worn Bible, and tended to the garden her late husband Henry had loved so much. The storm had ruined part of it. Rows of tomatoes were flattened, her roses were stripped of petals, and the soil was soaked through with debris. But she worked methodically, her dark hands steady, her movements deliberate. Henry had passed 6 years ago, and since then the garden was her way of keeping him close. Behind the house stood a shed, small, wooden, and half forgotten. It had once been Henry's domain, filled with tools, spare lumber, and jars of screws labeled in his neat handwriting. Ellen hadn't stepped inside for months. During the storm, she had heard the shed creak and moan, the roof rattling like it might fly off. Now that the skies were clear, she decided to take a look, more out of duty than curiosity. The door was swollen from the rain, and it took several hard pulls before it gave way with a groan. A rush of air, thick with mildew and rot, escaped into the sunlight. Ellen coughed and stepped inside. The faint smell of kerosene mixed with old earth filled her lungs. Dust motes floated in the slanting light that fell through a gap in the roof. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The shelves were just as she remembered them. Henry's tools lined neatly in their boxes, though rust now crept along their edges. A stack of paint cans sat in one corner, labels faded and sticky with time, but something felt different. The air was heavier, and beneath the smell of decay was another odor, sweet, almost syrupy. Her gaze drifted upward toward the rafters. That was when she saw it. In the farthest corner, where the roof sagged and shadows clung thickest, hung something large and dark. At first, she thought a tarp had blown in through the damaged roof and tangled itself around the beam. But as she stepped closer, she saw that it wasn't fabric at all. It was a shape, oblong, smooth, and faintly glistening. It hung from a thick, sinewy cord attached to the rafter. It looked almost alive. Ellen froze. The thing was roughly the size of a person, maybe 3 feet long, shaped like a swollen pod. Its surface seemed leathery, ridged in places like stretched skin. When she leaned slightly forward, she could have sworn it pulsed. Just once. A slow, rhythmic movement, like the faint contraction of a living muscle. Her throat went dry. She took a careful step back, heart thudding. A faint, brittle sound reached her ears, a tiny crackling, as if twigs were snapping deep inside it. It was so soft, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She stood there for several seconds, unable to decide whether to look away or to keep staring. Finally, she backed out of the shed, pulling the door shut behind her. The old hinges squealed as the latch caught. Outside, the wind stirred the grass, and the familiar warmth of daylight steadied her shaking hands. Ellen leaned against the fence and tried to laugh at herself. "Probably some kind of wasp nest," she murmured, though even as she said it, she knew that was impossible. It was far too big, too strange. But she refused to let her imagination run wild. After all, she'd lived through worse. She'd buried her husband, survived the storm, and patched her house with her own 2 hands. Whatever that thing was, she'd deal with it later. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind had died completely, but the house seemed to breathe in the silence, settling and sighing as the wood cooled. The sound reminded her of the shed, of that faint cracking she had heard. Around midnight, she got up, made herself tea, and stood by the kitchen window looking out toward the backyard. The shed stood there, dark and ordinary in the moonlight, but something about its stillness unsettled her. It felt like something waiting. The next morning, sunlight poured across her yard. Birds had returned, chattering in the trees. The storm's chaos already seemed like a bad memory. Ellen put on her gloves and went back to work clearing debris, but every time her eyes strayed toward the shed, she felt a prick of unease. By midday, she told herself to stop being foolish. She decided she would check the shed again, if only to prove to herself that it was nothing to fear. She approached slowly, the grass crunching beneath her boots. The latch was still fastened. She hesitated, then opened the door. The smell hit her first. Stronger now, that same sweet, rotting scent. Inside, the light was dimmer, the air warmer. The object in the corner was still there, but something about it had changed. It looked larger. The cord that held it seemed stretched tighter. Beneath it, the dirt floor was damp, as though something had dripped during the night. Ellen frowned and stepped closer, squinting. The outer surface appeared to have darkened. In one spot, she saw something like condensation, tiny droplets of moisture forming and sliding down. She wanted to believe it was from the humidity, but deep down she sensed it wasn't. The air was too dry for that. She turned and left quickly, shutting the door once more. That evening, she called her neighbor, George, who lived 2 houses down. George was a retired farmer, a big man with a soft drawl who prided himself on knowing every animal and pest in the county. When she described what she'd seen, he chuckled and said, "Probably some kind of hornet nest. They get big this time of year." "No," she insisted, "it's not like that. It's bigger. It looks alive." "Well, if it's alive, then it's probably just nature doing what nature does. Don't mess with it, Ellen. Let the critters sort themselves out." She thanked him, but hung up feeling frustrated. People in town always saw her as Miss Ellen, the quiet widow with her garden and her neat little house. No one ever thought she could be the one seeing something worth worrying about. That night, the unease in her chest grew into a knot. She dreamed of the shed again. In the dream, she opened the door, and the thing inside filled the entire room, stretching and throbbing, pressing against the walls as if it wanted out. She woke up sweating, the sound of the cracking still echoing faintly in her ears. The next day, she stayed inside as long as she could, pretending to ignore it. She cooked breakfast, listened to the radio, and tried to read, but every few minutes her eyes flicked toward the window. At last, in the late afternoon, she went out onto the porch. The air was heavy and humid. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured again, a reminder that the season of storms wasn't yet over. She stood there for a long while, staring at the shed. The door looked the same. The roof sagged the same way. Nothing had changed, and yet, deep down, Ellen knew that something was happening in there. Something was growing. She could feel it, even from here. When the first fireflies began to blink above the wet grass, she finally went back inside, locking her doors behind her. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard it again. That low, muffled sound from the shed, like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. She closed her eyes, tried to tell herself it was only the wind in the trees, but the rhythm continued, slow and steady, until it matched her own pulse. Ellen didn't know it yet, but that was the night her quiet, ordinary life began to unravel. The storm had passed, yes, but something else had been left behind in its wake. Something that had found a home in the dark corner of her shed, and that was now, silently, waiting for its time to come. For the next few days, Ellen tried to convince herself that she had overreacted. The mind played tricks, especially after long bouts of isolation and bad weather. The storm had unsettled her in ways she didn't want to admit, but no amount of reasoning could quiet the instinct that told her something was wrong inside that shed. It was a quiet intuition that never truly left her, a whisper at the back of her mind that became louder every time she passed by the window and caught sight of the crooked roof. On the third morning after she first discovered the thing, the sky was pale and colorless, a thin layer of mist hanging over the neighborhood. Ellen poured herself coffee and stared through the kitchen window. The shed sat in the distance, slouched against the fence line like a weary old beast. The sunlight glinted faintly off one of the bent hinges, and she thought she saw the door tremble ever so slightly. She blinked, thinking perhaps it was just the morning breeze. Still, her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. She was no longer certain what the difference was between seeing and imagining. By mid-morning, she decided to go out. The unease had grown into something tangible, like a weight on her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She stepped into her boots, tied her scarf, and crossed the damp grass. The door resisted when she pulled it open, as though something inside pressed faintly back. The air that escaped was warm and thick, carrying a scent that made her recoil, a sweetness mixed with rot, like fruit left too long in the sun. She waited at the threshold, listening. There was no movement, no sound, only that faint, ever-present hum in the air, too low to pinpoint. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and then she saw it. The cocoon. It was definitely larger now, stretching further toward the ground, its bottom nearly brushing the dirt floor. What had once been dry and leathery now glistened faintly, as though coated with a thin layer of moisture. The color had deepened from dull gray to a bruised brown, streaked with darker veins that pulsed faintly if she stared long enough. Ellen's stomach turned. She could almost sense it breathing, slow and deliberate. She took a hesitant step closer, half hoping her eyes deceived her. When she reached out to touch the beam beside it, she felt warmth radiating from the wood. That was impossible. The shed had no electricity, and the morning air was cool. She backed away quickly and pulled the door closed behind her, gasping as if she had just come up from underwater. For several moments she stood outside, clutching the latch, her pulse hammering. The breeze that swept across her yard carried the smell of wet grass and smoke from a neighbor's fire, but she could still taste the sweetness of decay in her mouth. It lingered, clinging to her senses like oil. That evening, she couldn't bring herself to go back inside the shed. Instead, she sat on the porch with her old notebook and began writing down what she had seen. Dates, observations, small details, anything that could help her make sense of it. She noted the changes in color, the increase in size, and the heat she had felt. The act of writing steadied her, gave her the illusion of control. She decided that if the cocoon continued to grow, she would call someone, but who she didn't yet know. That night, she woke from a shallow sleep to a faint noise. At first, she thought it was rain, but when she listened closely, it was more like a vibration, a steady, low hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. She followed it to the back door where the sound was strongest. Through the kitchen window, she saw a faint shimmer, almost imperceptible, like heat waves above asphalt. It was coming from the direction of the shed. Her heart began to beat faster. She thought about calling George, but the clock on the wall read just after midnight. He would only laugh again, tell her she was hearing wind or frogs or her own heart. She stood there for several minutes before finally turning away, but even after she went back to bed, the hum continued in her head, soft but constant, until she fell into uneasy dreams. The following morning, she found small flies gathered along the kitchen window pane. That, by itself, wasn't unusual in the humid southern air, but there were too many. Dozens of them, sluggish and glistening, their wings dusted with what looked like fine yellow powder. When she opened the back door, the smell from the yard struck her like a physical thing. It was faint, but distinct, a mix of earth, rot, and something sweetly chemical, like overripe melon. She followed it to the shed, though every instinct told her to stay away. The latch creaked under her hand. Inside, the air was even thicker than before, almost humid enough to taste. The cocoon filled the corner like a living presence. The surface shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though sweating. Beneath it, the dirt floor was darker now, soaked through in a spreading circle. Tiny, hair-thin trails ran outward from the puddle, like veins etched into the soil. She squatted and touched one. It was sticky. Ellen drew her hand back immediately. Whatever this was, it wasn't any nest or animal she knew. She remembered Henry once telling her about beehives collapsing in heat, how they released wax and honey when the structure softened, but this was nothing like that. The substance clinging to her fingers was warm and viscous, almost like oil. She wiped her hand on her jeans and hurried out, closing the door so hard it rattled the walls. For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the sense that the thing was watching her. It was a foolish thought. There were no eyes in that glistening mass, but the sensation persisted. Every time she walked past the window or heard a faint thump somewhere outside, her skin prickled. By afternoon, she decided she needed to do something. She wasn't helpless. She had lived through hurricanes, patched roofs, fixed engines. She would set up her camera and record it. If the cocoon really was changing, she would have proof. In the attic, she found the old camcorder she had once used for her students back when she taught science at the local middle school. The batteries were long dead, but she still had the charger. By nightfall, she had it ready. She set the camera on a tripod inside the shed, facing the cocoon, and ran an extension cord to the porch outlet. She adjusted the focus until the faint outline of the object was clear on the small screen, then turned it on. As the red light blinked, Ellen felt an odd mixture of fear and satisfaction. She was doing something, not just sitting around waiting for her imagination to take over. She left the shed door slightly ajar so the camera could capture any movement. Then she went back inside, locked the house, and sat in her living room with a book she never managed to read. The hours passed slowly. The television murmured in the background, and rain began to fall again, soft and persistent. When she finally went to bed, the rhythmic drumming on the roof mingled with the distant hum from the shed. She tried to ignore it. At dawn, she hurried out with her coat still over her nightgown, eager and afraid to see what the camera had captured. Inside the shed, the smell was unbearable now, thick enough to make her gag. She shut off the camera, brought it to the kitchen table, and rewound the tape. The footage began with static, then the dark shape of the cocoon flickered into view. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, somewhere around 2 a.m, the screen showed movement. The cocoon began to pulse rhythmically, expanding and contracting like a living lung. The surface seemed to ripple, as though something inside was turning over. Then came another sound, faint but distinct, a crack, sharp and wet like fabric tearing. Ellen's stomach twisted. She fast-forwarded through the next few minutes, and the pulsing continued, stronger each time, until the image blurred. When the recording ended, she sat motionless for a long while. Her hands trembled slightly. There was no doubt now that the thing was alive. Something was happening inside it. For the rest of the day, Ellen moved through her house like a ghost. She avoided the shed completely, pretending not to see it from the window. But as dusk fell, she caught sight of something new. A faint, shifting glow seeped through the cracks of the shed door, a pale, amber light flickering like a heartbeat. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make her skin crawl. That night, she dreamed of Henry. In her dream, he was standing in the shed, hammer in hand, calling her to come look at something. She tried to move toward him, but her feet stuck fast in the dirt. Behind him, the cocoon swelled until it touched the rafters, and Henry turned his head toward her. But his eyes were hollow, his mouth sealed shut by the same leathery material that covered the thing itself. She woke, screaming, the sound echoing through the empty house. Morning brought no peace. Ellen found that the flies had multiplied again, clustering near the windows and dying in small piles on the sill. The smell from the backyard was stronger, drifting even into the house. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The situation had become more than strange. It was dangerous. By afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her first thought was to call George again, but he wouldn't take her seriously. Then she thought of the county pest control office. Maybe they could tell her what it was. As her finger hovered over the keypad, she hesitated. What would she even say? I have a living cocoon the size of a man in my shed? They'd think she was losing her mind. Still, she wrote down the number on a notepad and kept it nearby. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the trees, rattling the loose panels on the shed. The sky had darkened with heavy clouds. As night settled, Ellen stood by the window watching the first lightning flicker across the horizon. The shed was just a dark shape in the distance now, but she knew it was there, waiting. She couldn't see it move, couldn't hear it, but somehow she felt it pulsing, a presence pressing faintly against her thoughts. And when the thunder rolled across the fields, she whispered softly to herself, "Tomorrow. I'll call tomorrow." But deep down, she already sensed that by tomorrow the thing in the shed would have changed again. Something was unfolding in the dark, something that would not wait for her courage. The quiet dread that had begun with curiosity was turning into fear, a kind she had never known before, the kind that comes when you realize the danger growing near you is alive, patient, and unstoppable. The following morning arrived under a dull sky that seemed to hang low over Beaumont. The air was heavy with the kind of wet heat that clung to the lungs, and a gray haze rose from the soaked ground. Ellen awoke before dawn, her heart still pounding from the remnants of a dream she couldn't fully remember. All she knew was that she'd heard the same sound again, the slow, muffled thump of something moving behind the shed walls. For a long moment, she lay there in the silence of her small bedroom, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of cicadas beginning their morning song. Then she sat up and made her decision. She wasn't going to wait another day. The unease had grown into something sharper, like a thorn in her mind that refused to let her rest. The footage she'd recorded was proof enough that the cocoon was alive, but the idea of it continuing to grow, changing, while she did nothing made her feel weak. She couldn't stand that. She had spent her whole life solving problems, patching roofs, fixing fences, tending to things until they were right again. Fear or not, she would handle this too. Ellen ate a small breakfast she barely tasted. Then she went to the pantry, found the old can of kerosene Henry had used for lighting the oil lamps decades ago, and carried it outside. The metal sloshed when she moved, the faint chemical smell sharp in her nose. She told herself she was just taking precautions, that she would start small. Maybe a little fire would drive whatever was inside out, and she could see what she was dealing with. The rational part of her mind, the one that always wanted to believe in simple explanations, clung to that hope. The shed loomed at the edge of her property, crooked and pale in the weak morning light. The grass around it had turned patchy and yellow, and flies buzzed near the doorframe. As she approached, she caught the now familiar sweetness in the air, thicker, almost syrupy. It clung to her clothes, coated her tongue when she breathed. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to continue. She opened the door and froze. The cocoon was enormous. It nearly touched the floor now, its lower edge sagging slightly under its own weight. The color had changed again, no longer brown, but a deep, oily black, streaked with dark green veins that shimmered faintly when the light shifted. The surface rippled in slow, shallow waves, as though something inside was pressing outward. Ellen could feel the heat of it from several feet away. She set down the kerosene can and backed up, her breath catching in her throat. "This has to stop," she whispered. Her voice barely sounded like her own. She took one last look, then stepped outside to prepare. From the shed, she gathered a long iron rod, an old broom handle, and a torn piece of cloth she tied to the end. She soaked the cloth in kerosene until it dripped, then fetched the matches she kept by the back door. Her hands shook as she struck one. The flame caught quickly, flaring orange in the humid air. For a moment, she felt powerful again, capable, decisive. She gripped the makeshift torch tightly and returned to the shed. Inside, the air was suffocating. The smell was stronger than ever, sharp enough to sting her eyes. The cocoon's presence seemed to fill the space, pressing outward in silence. Ellen took a deep breath and stepped closer. When she raised the torch, the firelight threw strange shadows across the walls, and for a moment, she thought she saw the outline of something moving inside the cocoon. Slow, deliberate motions, like the turning of a great body. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't let herself hesitate. She touched the fire to the base of the cocoon. Nothing happened. The flames licked the surface, but the material didn't catch. It glistened as if coated in oil, yet refused to burn. Instead, it began to move. The outer layer contracted sharply, pulling inward with a wet sound, as though reacting to pain. The light flickered across the leathery ridges, and then came the noise, a deep, muffled crack that made the walls tremble. Ellen stumbled back, nearly dropping the torch. The cocoon began to pulse rapidly now, faster than before. Each contraction was followed by a sound like air escaping from beneath the surface, accompanied by a sharp chemical odor that burned her nose. The air shimmered as the temperature rose. Then, suddenly, the torch sputtered out. The flame died in her hands, smothered by the strange fumes pouring from the cocoon. Panic seized her. She dropped the stick, backed away, coughing as her lungs filled with the acrid scent. Her eyes watered so badly she could barely see. She staggered out of the shed, into the open air, gasping for breath. The sunlight felt blindingly bright, the sky spinning above her. She bent over, clutching her knees, coughing until her throat ached. When she finally straightened, she realized the back of her throat tasted metallic, like blood. For several minutes she stood in the yard, shaking. When she dared to look back, she saw that thin wisps of smoke, or perhaps vapor, were drifting from the cracks in the shed. The structure itself seemed to vibrate faintly, the wood creaking as though something heavy shifted inside. She wanted to run back and burn the entire thing to the ground, but the memory of that sudden heat stopped her. She had the sickening sense that if she went closer, she might not come back out. By midday, the air had gone still again. Ellen stayed inside, keeping the curtains drawn. She could still smell the fumes on her skin and her hair, no matter how many times she washed her hands. Her chest hurt when she breathed deeply. She sat by the window, watching the shed from a distance. Occasionally, a faint ripple of movement crossed the wall, as if the cocoon's vibrations reached through the wood itself. She thought about calling the pest control number she'd written down, but shame held her back. What if they came and found nothing? What if they thought she was losing her mind? She had lived too long in this neighborhood to risk becoming the subject of whispers, and yet she knew she couldn't leave it as it was. That evening, as the sun began to set, a strange stillness fell over the yard. The air cooled slightly, but with it came a sound she hadn't heard before, a low, rhythmic clicking, faint but steady like the ticking of a clock. It was coming from inside the shed. Each click seemed to echo longer than the last, blending into a quiet hum that made her teeth ache. The birds that usually perched on the fence were gone. Not a single insect chirped. The silence pressed down like a weight. As darkness gathered, Ellen saw something new. The puddle beneath the shed door had spread, forming a dark stain on the ground. When she stepped closer, she saw that it shimmered faintly, reflecting the last light of the sunset like oil on water. Her stomach turned. Whatever was inside that cocoon wasn't just alive. It was changing the environment around it. That night, she could hardly sleep. The hum was louder now, penetrating even the walls of her house. At times, it rose in pitch until it became almost a whine, then fell again to a low vibration that she could feel through the floorboards. Once or twice she thought she heard a faint scratching sound, like something dragging across wood. When she looked out the window, the shed seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, a subtle movement she might have imagined but couldn't unsee. Sometime around 3 a.m, she finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake with a start when a sharp crack echoed from the yard. She ran to the window. The shed door stood slightly open, swinging gently on its hinges. A faint mist poured out, curling along the grass. Her first thought was that the cocoon had burst, but the air outside remained eerily still. She waited for movement, for anything to emerge, but nothing came. Slowly, she backed away from the window and locked every door in the house. When the sun rose, she found the door closed again, as if it had never moved. But something had definitely changed. The soil near the shed looked scorched, discolored in a circular pattern. The grass around it had withered overnight. Ellen stood at the edge of the yard for a long time, the heat from the early morning sun pressing on her shoulders, and realized that she could no longer handle this alone. She might be old, but she wasn't foolish. Still, as she turned to go back inside, she hesitated. Her eyes were drawn once more to the shed, to the faint outline of the thing inside. There was a strange, rhythmic motion to it, a kind of breathing she could almost feel in her bones. The air seemed to hum around her, alive with quiet energy. She shivered and stepped away. By late afternoon, she had made up her mind. She would call someone, anyone, who could deal with this properly. She would tell them exactly what she had seen, no matter how strange it sounded. But as the day faded into another heavy, breathless evening, she couldn't bring herself to make the call. She sat at her kitchen table, the phone beside her, staring out the window. The shed was just a dark outline against the dimming sky, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of her, that it somehow knew she had tried to destroy it and failed. The first storm clouds of a new front were gathering over Beaumont, their undersides glowing orange with the reflection of the setting sun. A faint rumble of thunder rolled across the fields. Ellen watched them come, thinking of how small her house was, how fragile everything around her suddenly felt. When the first flash of lightning illuminated the yard, she saw something that froze her blood. The Cocoon's shadow through the cracks in the shed had moved, not swaying from the wind, but shifting deliberately, pressing outward. For just a second, she saw the faintest trace of a human-like outline beneath the pulsing surface. Then the light faded, and the world went dark again. She didn't move for a long time. The thunder came closer, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof. Ellen sat by the window, hands clasped tight, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. She didn't know what was happening in her shed, but she knew one thing with terrible certainty. Whatever was inside wasn't done growing. And the next time it moved, it might not stay contained. The storm that rolled in that night was not as violent as the hurricane that had torn through Beaumont weeks before, but to Ellen it felt heavier, closer. Rain slammed against her windows in steady waves, and the thunder came in long, rumbling growls that shook the thin walls of her house. She sat in her chair by the kitchen window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the lightning flash over the yard. Each burst illuminated the silhouette of the shed, and every time it appeared in that stark white glare, she thought she saw movement. Just a faint tremor, like the whole structure was breathing in rhythm with the thunder. Sleep was out of the question. When the wind finally began to ease, around 3 a.m, she got up and stood in the middle of her kitchen, listening. There was no sound at first, then she heard it, the same low clicking, faint and mechanical, but now accompanied by another noise, softer, wetter, like the rustling of damp cloth. It seemed to seep through the walls, finding her no matter where she stood. Ellen pressed her palms against her ears, but it didn't stop. It wasn't a sound that came entirely through the air. It was something that resonated in her bones, in the back of her skull, like a vibration alive inside her. When dawn came, she was pale and trembling, exhausted but determined. She had reached her limit. She could no longer deny that whatever was happening in the shed was beyond her understanding, and likely beyond her control. As the first gray light crept through the clouds, Ellen picked up the phone and called the pest control number she had written down days earlier. The woman on the line listened patiently as Ellen tried to explain, her voice cracking, her words stumbling. "It's some kind of infestation," Ellen said finally. Bigger than I've ever seen. It's alive. It's moving." By noon, a white van pulled into her driveway, the words Beaumont County Environmental Control stenciled on the side. Two men climbed out, wearing khaki uniforms with patches on their sleeves. They introduced themselves as Tom and Carl, though Ellen barely remembered which was which. She led them through the backyard, the grass squelching underfoot. The men joked lightly as they approached the shed, but Ellen noticed how their voices dropped when they smelled the air. The stench was undeniable now, sweet and chemical, mixed with something acrid that made their eyes water. Carl muttered a curse under his breath. Tom pushed open the door, then stopped short. "Good Lord," he whispered. The cocoon loomed before them, massive and dark, filling the far corner like a growth of living stone. Steam curled faintly from its surface. Ellen stayed near the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself while the men moved closer. Tom crouched, extending a metal pole with a small hook on the end. When the hook touched the surface, the entire cocoon shuddered. A deep vibration rippled through the air, so low it seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath their feet. Tom jerked his hand back, the pole clattering against the wall. "Did you see that?" he said, voice thin with disbelief. "It reacted." Carl frowned and leaned closer. "Could be heat," he said uncertainly, "or pressure change. Let's get a reading." From the van, they fetched a thermal sensor and a handheld monitor. When Tom pointed the scanner at the cocoon, the screen flickered with shifting colors, orange, red, then white. 38 degrees Celsius, he said quietly. "That's body temperature." Ellen's stomach tightened. "You mean it's alive?" Tom didn't answer. He stepped back, shaking his head. "I've seen hornet nests as big as basketballs, but this is something else. Maybe a fungal growth, or hell, I don't even know. We'll have to call the university." They collected a few air samples, sealed them in vials, and took photographs before leaving. Before they drove off, Tom turned to Ellen. "Don't go back in there, ma'am," he said firmly. "Until we figure out what this is, keep the door closed. If you start to feel sick, headaches, dizziness, get out of the house and call us. We'll be in touch by tomorrow." That night was eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the world damp and heavy. Ellen sat by her window, staring at the shed. The porch light cast a small circle of yellow against the dark, but beyond that, the yard was black. She could almost feel the cocoon pulsing in the darkness, a heartbeat buried in the soil. She tried to distract herself by turning on the television, but the news blurred together. Stories of recovery efforts, missing pets, the lingering damage from the hurricane. She switched it off and sat in silence until the first birds began to sing at dawn. The following afternoon, another vehicle arrived, this one bearing the seal of the Texas Department of Wildlife and Ecology. 3 people stepped out, dressed in white protective suits with masks and gloves. One of them, a woman with a calm, even voice, introduced herself as Dr. Ramirez. "The Pest Control Office sent us your file," she explained. "They think you may have discovered a nesting site for a migratory species. We'd like to take a closer look, if that's all right." Ellen nodded, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. She led them to the shed. The specialists moved efficiently, setting up equipment, a thermal camera, small monitors, and a portable light array that filled the dim space with sterile brightness. The cocoon glistened under the light, its surface wet and translucent in places. Ellen had never seen anything so grotesquely beautiful. Dr. Ramirez leaned close, her gloved hand tracing the air an inch from the surface. "It's organic," she murmured, "and warm. Definitely alive, but not vertebrate tissue, something more complex. Look at these fibers along the seam. They're interwoven, almost like muscle strands." She adjusted a small probe attached to a fiber optic camera and slid it gently into a thin fissure near the base. The tiny monitor flickered to life. Ellen gasped. On the screen, she could see movement. Hundreds of small, pale forms packed tightly together, twitching in rhythm. "Larva," one of the men said softly. "A colony." Ramirez nodded. "Not just a colony," she said. "It's a single organism. They've fused together, forming a communal structure. I've read papers about this kind of behavior in certain species of wasps and beetles, but nothing of this scale. This is extraordinary." Ellen's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it dangerous?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her readings, frowning at the data on the tablet. "The air quality inside is poor," she said finally. "Ammonia levels are elevated. There are traces of something else, volatile organic compounds. You said you tried to burn it?" Ellen nodded. "It didn't catch. The fire went out by itself. The smell was awful." "That's consistent," Ramirez said grimly. "It's producing gases, possibly defensive toxins. If they build up enough pressure, the structure could rupture. That would release everything inside." Carl, one of the pest control men who had returned to assist, swore softly. "So, what do we do? Kill it?" "We can't risk that until we understand what it is," Ramirez replied. "For now, we need to contain the site." By late afternoon, they had sealed the shed with plastic sheeting and tape, running ventilation tubes from the roof. A yellow warning sign was staked in the yard. Ellen stood on her porch, watching them work. The neighbors began to notice, too. Curtains shifted, phones were raised. By evening, 2 police cars arrived, blocking the street. Ramirez approached Ellen with a clipboard. "We're recommending a temporary evacuation for your safety," she said. "The air inside your home is already showing traces of the compounds. You'll stay at a motel until we finish testing." Ellen's knees weakened. "You mean I have to leave my house?" "Just for a few days," the doctor said gently. "It's precautionary. We'll keep you updated." Ellen packed a small suitcase that night. Just clothes, her Bible, and a framed photograph of Henry. When she looked around the house, the rooms seemed different, hollowed out. The shed loomed outside her kitchen window, the plastic wrapping fluttering in the wind like a pale shroud. She thought she heard faint tapping from within, rhythmic and ceaseless. At the motel, she lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of the television from the next room, the distant hum of traffic. Yet her thoughts were still in her yard, circling the sealed shed. She imagined the scientists back there, moving carefully around that dark, living shape, documenting it, measuring it. Part of her wanted them to destroy it outright, to burn the whole structure and end this nightmare. But another part, the curious, rational part that had guided her all her life, wanted to know what it truly was. The next morning, her phone rang. It was Dr. Ramirez. "We've confirmed elevated toxin levels," she said. "Your decision to report this may have prevented a serious incident. We're expanding the perimeter as a precaution." "What kind of toxins?" Ellen asked. "Ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and something else we haven't identified yet," Ramirez said. "It appears to be a byproduct of metabolic activity. We also detected heat signatures consistent with accelerated growth. It's evolving quickly. We'll be bringing in additional equipment and personnel." Ellen thanked her and hung up. She sat for a long time staring at the wall. The idea that something alive, something unnatural, had been thriving only a few feet from where she slept filled her with a cold, creeping horror. But mingled with that fear was a strange sense of awe. She had seen it first. She had witnessed the beginning of whatever this was. 2 days later, the news reached the local station. The headline read, "Possible biological hazard prompts evacuation in Beaumont neighborhood." The article was vague, referring only to a suspected contamination event and assuring readers there was no cause for panic. But Ellen knew better. She saw the unmarked trucks arriving, the white tents going up, the men in full suits carrying sealed containers. By the end of the week, the entire block had been evacuated. Police cordoned off the street, and a temporary barrier was erected around her property. The shed, her shed, was now classified as a restricted area. Standing behind the yellow tape, Ellen watched as technicians entered and exited through a decontamination tunnel. In the distance, she could still see the faint bulge of the cocoon pressing against the plastic sheeting, larger than ever. She felt a mix of dread and pride, an uneasy recognition that her quiet little life had intersected with something vast and incomprehensible. Yet, as night fell and the floodlights flickered on, bathing her property in harsh white light, she couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end of it, or if the thing she had found in her shed was only beginning to reveal what it was capable of. For the first time in her life, Ellen saw her quiet neighborhood turn into something that looked like a disaster zone. It began, gradually, with the sound of trucks arriving in the early morning and the low hum of machinery from her backyard. From the motel window, she could see the flashing amber lights of utility vehicles and men in white suits walking in pairs down her street. By noon, the local police had closed off the block entirely. The sound of generators droned endlessly, and the faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air even from where she was staying, half a mile away. The world she had known for nearly 4 decades was now behind fences, wrapped in plastic and warning tape. The first evacuation order was announced through the local radio station that afternoon. The announcer's voice tried to sound calm as he explained that a biological containment effort was underway in a residential area near the southern edge of Beaumont. Residents were urged to cooperate with authorities and relocate temporarily. No one was told what the danger was, only that it was non-viral and contained. But Ellen knew the truth. She knew it was not some leak or chemical spill. It was that thing growing in her shed, that had turned an entire neighborhood into a restricted zone. The motel she was in quickly filled with displaced families. Some recognized her. They whispered when she passed, though no one said anything directly. A few houses down from her property lived the Nelsons, a young couple with 2 children. Ellen overheard the husband speaking in the hallway. "They say it started at that old woman's house," he muttered, not realizing she could hear. "Something she brought back after the storm. Spores or eggs or something." His wife hushed him, but the words still stung. Ellen closed her door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They trembled, though from exhaustion or guilt she couldn't tell. That evening, she turned on the television and saw aerial footage of her street. A reporter stood outside the cordoned perimeter, microphone in hand, while uniformed officers waved away curious onlookers. Behind the reporter, hazy through the glare of floodlights, Ellen could see the faint outline of her house, and behind it, the plastic-wrapped silhouette of the shed. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Possible contamination prompts evacuation in Beaumont suburb." She muted the sound. She didn't need to hear the speculation. She could already imagine it. Later that night, she received a call from Dr. Ramirez. The woman's voice sounded different now, clipped and tired. "Mrs. Mays," she began, "I wanted to let you know that the containment perimeter has been expanded. We've discovered elevated airborne toxins in adjacent properties. As a precaution, the local authorities have ordered a full evacuation within a 2-mile radius. It's only temporary." Ellen's breath caught. 2 miles? That's hundreds of people. "I know," Ramirez said softly. "It's purely precautionary. We're working around the clock to neutralize the source." "The source?" Ellen repeated. "You mean my shed?" A pause followed. "The structure inside your shed has shown accelerated growth," Ramirez admitted. "We're taking every possible measure to prevent a rupture. You did the right thing reporting it when you did." Ellen wanted to ask what would have happened if she hadn't, but she didn't. She thanked the doctor and hung up, staring at the phone for a long time. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping against the window like the ticking of a slow clock. By the next morning, panic had taken root. The evacuation order spread quickly through social media. People filmed the hazmat teams and posted shaky videos of helicopters circling above the containment site. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some said it was an experimental chemical leak from the refinery. Others claimed it was a government cover-up of a biological weapon. A few insisted it was something extraterrestrial. None of them were close to the truth, though Ellen wondered if the truth was any less frightening. At noon, she ventured downstairs to the motel lobby. Groups of evacuees clustered around their phones, watching the latest news updates. A woman near the vending machine noticed Ellen and whispered to her friend, who turned and stared. Ellen caught the look and felt her face flush. She retreated outside, where the parking lot shimmered with heat. A police cruiser idled at the curb, lights flashing. The officer inside was speaking into his radio. When he saw her, he stepped out. "Mrs. Mays?" he asked. "We've been told you might need to move farther out. They're expanding the restricted area again, just a few more miles. The county's setting up temporary housing at the community center west of town." Ellen nodded numbly. "Is it that bad?" He hesitated. "They're just being cautious, ma'am. There's some kind of gas leak involved, or so they say. Best not to stick around." She packed her things once more. As she loaded her bag into the car, she glanced back toward the east, where the faint orange haze of the containment lights still glowed over her neighborhood. A faint tremor passed through her stomach, the same dread she'd felt the first time she saw the cocoon. It had been small then, contained. Now it had changed the world around it. At the community center, evacuees slept on cots beneath fluorescent lights. Volunteers handed out sandwiches and bottled water. Ellen sat alone in a corner, clutching the small photograph of Henry she had carried with her. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp clothing. Children cried, and their parents tried to comfort them. Somewhere nearby, a generator hummed steadily. The sound reminded her of the cocoon's vibration. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling tiles, her mind looping back to the shed. She imagined the scientists working through the night, the way they had hovered over the monitors, their voices calm but tense. What if the cocoon burst? What if the gases spread farther than they expected? Every scenario her mind conjured ended the same way, with the neighborhood lost beneath a shimmering, toxic cloud. Sometime after midnight, a woman in a gray uniform entered the room, clipboard in hand. She spoke quietly with one of the volunteers, then approached Ellen. "Mrs. Mays," she said, "Dr. Ramirez asked me to inform you that they've stabilized the site. The containment units are holding. There's no immediate danger." Ellen let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank God." The woman nodded. "They'll keep monitoring for the next 48 hours. Once they're certain it's safe, residents can start returning home." For the first time in days, Ellen allowed herself to close her eyes. She pictured her house as it had been before all this began. The clean white curtains, the little garden out front, the worn porch where she'd sat with Henry on warm evenings. She tried to hold on to that memory as she drifted into a fitful sleep. But morning brought new fears. The news stations had picked up leaked footage, grainy images from a security drone hovering over the containment area. The video showed the shed wrapped in plastic, surrounded by lights, but beneath the translucent material, the cocoon was visible. It was enormous now, its shape distorted, bulging against the plastic sheeting as though trying to push its way free. The footage ended abruptly, but the damage was done. Social media exploded. People demanded answers. Some called for the National Guard. Others began leaving the city entirely. By afternoon, reporters had gathered near the barricades. Helicopters hovered overhead. The mayor appeared on television, insisting that the situation was under control. But Ellen could see the worry in his eyes. Later that evening, she received another call from Ramirez. The doctor's voice was calm, but there was tension beneath the surface. "We've contained the primary structure," she said, "but we've discovered residual contamination in the surrounding soil. It's nothing harmful if handled properly, but we can't risk reintroduction into the ecosystem. I'm afraid your shed will have to be dismantled." Ellen felt a deep pang in her chest, a strange grief she hadn't expected. "Dismantled?" she repeated. "It's just wood and nails." "It's a contaminated structure now," Ramirez said gently. "We'll rebuild if necessary. The priority is safety." Ellen thanked her again, though the words barely left her lips. When she hung up, she sat in silence. Outside the community center, the sky had turned a pale orange, heavy with dust. A convoy of trucks rumbled down the highway, heading toward her neighborhood. She imagined them tearing down her shed, hauling away the remains in sealed containers. The thought should have comforted her, but instead it filled her with unease. Something in her heart whispered that even if the cocoon was gone, the ground it had touched would never truly be clean again. Over the next 2 days, the evacuation extended farther, then began to retract. Officials spoke of positive progress, though they refused to give specifics. Gradually, the panic eased, replaced by a wary silence. The news cycle moved on, but Ellen could not. She stayed awake long into the night, replaying everything from the beginning. The day she found the cocoon, the way it pulsed in the dim light, the moment the flame had died in her hands. Every memory carried with it the same question. What had she really brought to life in that dark corner of her shed? On the fourth morning, Ramirez called again. Her voice was lighter this time. "We've neutralized the contamination, Mrs. Mays," she said. "The area is officially clear. You'll be able to return home tomorrow." Ellen pressed the phone to her ear. "It's gone?" "Yes, the structure has been destroyed and removed. Your home's been professionally cleaned and sealed. You're safe now." Safe. The word echoed in her mind long after she hung up. The next day, as she drove back toward her street, she passed through 2 checkpoints. The police waved her through after scanning her ID. Her heart pounded as she turned the final corner. Where her shed had once stood was now a bare patch of earth covered with fresh gravel. A line of bright orange stakes marked the perimeter. The house looked untouched, quiet as if nothing had happened. But Ellen knew better. She could feel it in the air, the faint trace of something burnt and chemical that the wind hadn't quite carried away. She stepped from her car and stood in the middle of the yard, breathing in the silence. Around her, the neighborhood was still empty. The fences leaned the same way, the trees swayed gently, but everything felt different, like a photograph slightly out of focus. When she finally turned toward the house, the sun was setting behind the trees. For the first time since the storm, the sky was clear. She should have felt relief, but instead there was only exhaustion and a lingering question that would not leave her. What if it wasn't over? Behind her, the gravel shifted in the faint wind. Ellen glanced back, her heart skipping a beat. Nothing moved. The ground lay still, the air heavy and quiet, and yet, in that silence, she could almost imagine hearing it again. The faintest, distant hum, buried deep beneath the earth, like something sleeping but not gone. Ellen had expected to feel relief when she returned home, but instead, what settled in her chest was a muted unease that refused to leave. The house stood exactly as she remembered it, the curtains drawn neatly, the porch swept clean by the wind, the potted flowers somehow still alive despite her absence, but it felt hollow. The silence was different now, thick and listening. She closed the front door behind her and stood in the middle of the kitchen, waiting for the comfort that never came. Even though the shed was gone, her eyes kept drifting to the window that faced the backyard, to the bare patch of earth where it had once stood. She could almost imagine the outline still there, a shadow printed into the soil. The air in the house smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic, a reminder that a team of professionals had scoured and disinfected every corner while she was gone. On the counter lay a folded report from the Environmental Control Department, full of charts and hazard codes she didn't understand. She skimmed the first page, but stopped when she saw the words unidentified bioorganic structure. She set the paper down quickly, her stomach tightening. She didn't want the scientific explanation. She wanted to forget that it had ever existed. For a day or two, she tried to convince herself that she could. She spent the morning cleaning rooms that were already spotless, dusting the windowsills, reorganizing cabinets, watering her plants. Yet, every few minutes, her gaze drifted back toward the yard. When the wind blew, she could see the gravel shift ever so slightly, as though the ground itself was exhaling. On the third morning, she found footprints in the dust near the edge of the gravel, heavy, circular indentations that didn't match her shoes or anyone else's. She crouched to inspect them, but they crumbled under her touch, leaving only faint outlines. That afternoon, she received another call from Dr. Ramirez. The woman's voice sounded brighter than before, though still professional. "Mrs. Mays," she began, "I wanted to thank you again for your cooperation. The investigation is nearly complete. I thought you might like to know what we've found." Ellen hesitated. Part of her didn't want to know, but curiosity got the better of her. "Go on," she said quietly. "Our analysis confirms that the cocoon was a colony, a composite organism made up of hundreds, possibly thousands of larvae working in symbiosis. It's similar to a species of parasitic wasp found in Central America, but there are clear mutations. We believe the hurricane carried fragments of their nest north, where they mixed with local species and adapted to the new environment. Ellen tried to picture it. Tiny eggs swept up in the storm, carried across states, landing in her damaged shed, finding warmth and darkness to grow. It was almost poetic, she thought bitterly. And the gas? She asked. Ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, Ramirez said. Both are natural byproducts of decomposition, but the levels we detected were unusually high. That's what made it so dangerous. The colony was producing heat, breaking down organic matter in the soil and releasing toxic fumes. If it had ruptured fully, the results could have been catastrophic. Ellen closed her eyes. You mean people could have died? Yes, Ramirez said softly. Many people. But your quick action prevented that. I don't say this lightly. You likely saved hundreds of lives. The praise washed over Ellen like a wave she couldn't quite feel. What happens now? She asked. The specimens we collected have been frozen for study, Ramirez replied. We're trying to understand how such an adaptive colony could form. It's possible this was a one-time event, but we can't rule out future occurrences. The soil around your property will remain under observation for several months. It's mostly precautionary. After the call ended, Ellen sat for a long time in silence. She thought of the scientists, the containment suits, the lights and machines that had surrounded her home. To them, this was a discovery, something to be cataloged and studied. To her, it was a memory she wanted buried forever. That night, the dreams returned. She saw her shed again, intact and whole, but the door hung open and warm light spilled out into the dark. When she stepped inside, the cocoon was gone. In its place lay a hollow shell, split down the center like a discarded husk. From the rafters hung long strands of silk that trembled as if breathing. She woke with her heart racing, the smell of rot still lingering in her nose. The next day, she walked to the backyard. The gravel was still damp from the night rain. The air was heavy and motionless, the kind of quiet that seemed to hum just below hearing. She crouched and touched the ground where the shed had stood. The soil was firm and cool, but she thought she could feel a faint warmth underneath, the ghost of the heat that once radiated from the cocoon. When she stood, her knees popped, and she realized how tired she was, not just from the past weeks, but from years of carrying her life alone. Later that afternoon, a small convoy of vehicles arrived at the edge of the street. Dr. Ramirez was among them, this time accompanied by 2 uniformed men and a tall woman carrying a sealed case. Ellen met them at the porch, uneasy but polite. Ramirez explained that they were here for final verification tests. It's just routine, she said. We'll be done within the hour. Ellen watched as they moved carefully across her yard, setting up instruments that beeped softly as they recorded data. One of the men drove a probe into the gravel, measuring gas levels. Another unpacked a thermal camera and scanned the ground. After a while, Ramirez approached her, her expression thoughtful. Temperatures still slightly above normal, she said. Residual heat, most likely. Nothing to worry about. But Ellen noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt. You're not sure, she said quietly. It's probably nothing, Ramirez repeated, though her tone had changed. If we detect anything unusual, we'll take deeper soil samples. When the team left that evening, Ellen stood at the window watching the taillights disappear down the road. The last rays of sunset stretched long across the yard, painting the gravel a dull red. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the surface shift again, just a subtle tremor, like breath beneath fabric. She blinked, and it was gone. That night, the sound returned. It began faintly, a low vibration that she felt more than heard. It seemed to rise from the ground itself, traveling through the foundation of the house, up through the floorboards. She lay still, afraid to move, her heart thudding in her chest. The hum grew louder, then softer again, like waves on the shore. It continued for what felt like hours before fading into silence. In the morning, she found her living room clock had stopped at 2:17. The power hadn't gone out, but the second hand stood frozen. She replaced the batteries, but it refused to start. When she looked out the window, the sky was bright and clear, the world deceptively normal. She told herself she was imagining things, that her nerves were simply frayed from all the stress. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from just beyond the edge of the yard. 2 days later, Ramirez called again. Her tone was measured but serious. "We've conducted a deeper analysis," she said. "The core of the colony appears to have undergone an additional phase before destruction. There were signs of a secondary structure forming inside, a kind of nursery. We found embryonic casings fused together, unlike anything we've seen. It's possible that part of the colony was in reproductive transition." Ellen's voice trembled. "You mean it was multiplying?" "Potentially," Ramirez admitted, "but we neutralized everything. There's no remaining biological activity on site. I'm only telling you because it's your property, and you deserve full transparency." Ellen thanked her mechanically, but when she hung up, she sat in her kitchen with the phone still in her hand. The word nursery echoed in her mind. She remembered the faint warmth in the ground, the tremor in the gravel. If part of the colony had been reproducing, then what if... She stopped herself. No, she wouldn't let her thoughts spiral again. It was over. It had to be. To distract herself, she drove into town for groceries, her first real outing since returning. People greeted her cautiously, their smiles polite but strained. News of the incident had spread far beyond Beaumont, though no one seemed to know exactly what had happened. The local newspaper called it a chemical anomaly. One man at the checkout muttered to his wife, "That's her, isn't it? The woman from the evacuation." Ellen pretended not to hear. She paid for her things and left quickly. By the time she got home, the sun was sinking low. The evening light washed over the gravel patch, turning it gold. For a moment, it almost looked peaceful again. She stood there for a long time, listening to the cicadas and the soft rustle of the trees. Then, just as she turned to go inside, she heard it. The faintest sound, like a sigh escaping the earth. Her heart skipped. She froze, listening. Nothing followed. Perhaps it had been the wind. Perhaps not. Inside, she poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling. She didn't tell anyone what she'd heard. She knew no one would believe her. That night, she kept a lamp burning in the corner of her bedroom and didn't close her eyes until the first light of dawn. When morning came, the sound was gone. The world outside was bright, ordinary, almost kind, but Ellen understood now that the story of what had happened in her shed would never truly end. It had left something behind, not a physical trace, but a presence, invisible yet enduring, like the faint hum of a machine that never quite shuts off. She found herself standing by the window again, staring at the gravel. She thought of the scientists and their theories, of their charts and confident words, but she knew something they didn't. The cocoon had not just been an accident of nature. It had been something more. A lesson, perhaps, or a warning. Something had come out of that storm and found her, a reminder that the world still held secrets far older and far stranger than anyone cared to believe. And though she didn't admit it aloud, she felt an odd kind of peace with that knowledge. It didn't matter whether anyone else believed her. She had seen it. She had survived it. And somewhere, deep in the earth, beneath the quiet hum of her empty yard, the echo of that living thing still lingered, patient and unseen. The morning Ellen finally woke without fear was quiet, calm, and full of the kind of light she hadn't seen since before the storm. The air outside her bedroom window shimmered faintly, clean and warm, and for the first time in weeks, she did not sense that invisible heaviness pressing against her thoughts. It had rained during the night, a soft, cleansing rain that left the world smelling of earth and renewal. When she stepped outside, the sky was the color of pale linen, streaked with the golden blush of sunrise. For a long while she stood on the porch in her robe, breathing deeply, letting the morning wind brush her cheeks. The gravel patch behind the house was still there, of course, but it looked different now. Workers from the county had come earlier that week to level the ground, removing the last pieces of containment material. They had even replaced the fence posts and reseeded the surrounding grass. It no longer looked like a wound on her land, just an empty space waiting to be something again. Ellen found herself drawn to it each morning, staring at the smooth expanse of soil where the shed had once stood. For months, that space had been a place of dread, a reminder of what she'd witnessed. Now it was only quiet, and she realized she had a choice. She could leave it barren and let it haunt her, or she could make it live again. She decided to rebuild, not a shed, but something different, something meant for growth, not for storage or darkness. The idea came to her as she was washing dishes, watching sunlight fall through the window in soft stripes. She pictured a greenhouse, modest and open, full of warmth and life. It was Henry's old dream, one they'd spoken about in the early years of their marriage but never managed to realize. The thought made her smile, a small, fragile thing that surprised her. It had been so long since she'd smiled without effort. She began the project quietly, ordering materials through the same hardware store where Henry had once bought his lumber. The young clerk recognized her name from the news, but was kind enough not to mention it. He helped her load the boards into her truck, his movements careful, respectful. When she returned home, she set to work with a determination that felt cleansing. The rhythm of building, measuring, hammering, pausing to wipe the sweat from her brow was almost meditative. Her body ached at night, but the pain was honest, physical, not the gnawing tension that had lived in her chest for so long. Each day, the frame rose a little higher. Neighbors began to return as the evacuation order was lifted, and though some still regarded her with curiosity or even suspicion, most offered quiet nods or small waves when they saw her working. A few stopped to talk, to thank her for what she'd done. "We heard it could have been a disaster," said one woman from across the street, her voice low but sincere. "If you hadn't reported it—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Ellen understood. She only nodded, not trusting herself to speak. When the greenhouse was finished, it wasn't grand or perfect. It was simple. Clear panels catching the light, wooden beams smelling of cedar, a door that creaked slightly when opened. Inside, Ellen arranged pots of herbs, small flowering plants, and tomato seedlings. She had bought them from the nursery on the edge of town, and as she placed each one in its pot, she whispered the names to herself like old friends. Basil, rosemary, geranium, life returning, one root at a time. The first evening she spent inside, the light slanted through the glass in long amber bands. Dust motes drifted lazily in the glow. Ellen sat on a small wooden stool, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the soft hum of insects outside. There was peace here. Real peace, not the brittle silence she had lived with before. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she imagined Henry sitting beside her, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his quiet voice saying, "You did good, Ellie. You made it beautiful." Later that night, when she stepped back into the house, she noticed something strange. She hadn't once thought about the cocoon while she worked. Not its smell, not its heat, not the sound of it pulsing in the dark. The memory had dulled, its edges softened by the rhythm of her new life. It would never leave her completely. She knew that, but it no longer ruled her. The house, too, felt lighter now. The shadows seemed thinner, the air easier to breathe. Weeks passed. The grass around the greenhouse grew tall and green again, and the flowers began to bloom. Occasionally, government inspectors stopped by to take samples from the soil, but they always left reassured. The contamination was gone, they said. The danger was over. One of them even told her that the story had reached the university in Austin, where students were studying the preserved fragments of the cocoon. "You made quite a discovery," the young man told her. She smiled politely, but said nothing. To her, it hadn't been a discovery at all. It had been a confrontation with fear, with mortality, with the strange, unpredictable power of the world. On the morning of the first truly hot day of summer, Ellen woke before sunrise and made herself coffee. The air was already thick and warm. She carried her cup out to the greenhouse and stood among the plants, watching the sky change color from lavender to gold. The glass panels glowed faintly in the dawn, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the soil of one of the pots, a tiny, almost imperceptible stir, like a worm twisting beneath the surface. Her breath caught, but when she leaned closer, she saw only the tip of a root breaking through, pale and delicate. She laughed softly, the sound startling in the quiet. That laughter, brief as it was, felt like release. It rose up through her chest, light and trembling, and when it faded, the silence that followed felt kind. She realized then that the fear she'd carried for so long had finally begun to loosen its grip. The world was unpredictable, yes, but it was also resilient. So was she. Later that week, a reporter called asking for an interview. Ellen politely declined. "There's nothing more to tell," she said. "It's finished now." The reporter persisted, asking what she had felt when she saw the cocoon for the first time, what it had looked like up close. Ellen hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the greenhouse, where sunlight glittered on the glass. "It looked alive," she said simply, and that was enough. Then she ended the call. As the months went by, life in Beaumont returned to its old rhythm. The evacuation became a distant memory, spoken of in fragments by people who had never been there. Children played in the streets again, and the hum of lawnmowers filled the weekends. Ellen's greenhouse flourished, becoming a small marvel among her neighbors. People stopped by to admire it, to ask her advice about planting. She found herself smiling more often, laughing even, something she hadn't thought she would do again. One afternoon in late summer, Dr. Ramirez visited unexpectedly. She arrived without her protective suit this time, dressed in ordinary clothes, her hair loose and her expression warm. They sat together on the porch, drinking lemonade. "You seem well," Ramirez said, looking toward the greenhouse. "You've made this place beautiful again." Ellen nodded. "It helps," she said. Working with living things, they don't judge you for what you've seen. Ramirez smiled faintly. We've learned a great deal from your case. It's going to change how we study colony structures. What happened here, it wasn't evil, you know. It was nature finding a way to survive, even in the strangest form. I know, Ellen said quietly. That's what makes it so terrifying. They sat in silence for a while, watching the breeze ripple through the trees. Finally, Ramirez stood and took Ellen's hand. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Mays, she said, and thank you for everything. After she left, Ellen walked back to the greenhouse. The air inside was warm and fragrant. She knelt to water the plants, moving slowly, methodically, her hands steady. Outside, the sun dipped low, filling the room with orange light. She looked up through the glass ceiling and saw the first stars beginning to appear. As she stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, Ellen felt something deep inside her settle, a calm acceptance, a closing of a circle. The storm, the fear, the sleepless nights, even the evacuation, all of it had led to this moment of stillness. The past was not gone, but it no longer had teeth. When she finally stepped outside, the sky had darkened to a deep indigo. The cicadas were singing again, their steady rhythm filling the air. Ellen walked to the edge of the yard and looked out over the land. The patch where the shed once stood was no longer a scar, but a beginning, a place reborn. She smiled to herself, small and serene, and whispered, "It's over now." And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. The night wrapped gently around her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Above her, the stars flickered softly, indifferent and eternal. Behind her, the greenhouse glowed faintly in the darkness, a quiet beacon of light and life, standing where fear had once taken root. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe for more shocking, true-style stories every week. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. You won't believe what's coming next.